The hungriest people are often the ones who still choose to share. The winter wind swept across the edge of Black Hollow Pack territory, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke through the narrow valley. Aloan Hartwell pulled her worn gray coat tighter around her shoulders as she made her way home along the frozen path. The sun had already slipped behind the pine-covered hills, leaving the world washed in shades of silver and blue. Her boots crunched softly over a thin layer of ice, and each breath drifted from her lips in pale clouds. She was tired, more tired than she cared to admit. The small canvas bag hanging from her arm felt almost weightless because there was so little inside it. A single loaf of bread. That was all she had managed to buy after spending the afternoon mending torn blankets for a family in the village. The payment had barely been enough, but she had accepted it with a grateful smile anyway. In Black Hollow, nobody paid much attention to an Omega like Aloan. She lived alone in a tiny cabin near the forest boundary, far from the center of the pack where the stronger wolves gathered. People were polite when they needed something repaired, a shirt sewn, a coat patched, a curtain hemmed. After that, they forgot she existed. It had been that way for years. Aloan tried not to let it bother her. Most days she succeeded. Tonight was harder. She had not eaten since early that morning, and even then it had only been a cup of broth. Her stomach tightened painfully as she glanced down at the loaf. The smell drifted upward through the paper wrapping, warm and comforting despite the cold. She smiled faintly. Back at the cabin, she would light the stove, heat water for tea, and enjoy every bite. It was a simple plan, a small happiness, the kind she had learned to treasure. The path curved around a cluster of snow-covered trees. That was when she noticed someone sitting beneath a large cedar. At first she thought it was a fallen branch or a shadow. Then the figure moved. Aloan slowed. A man sat with his back against the trunk, his dark coat dusted with snow. His head was lowered, and for a moment he seemed completely still. Then he looked up. Even from several yards away, she could see exhaustion written across his face. He looked cold, very cold. His dark hair was damp with melting snow, and there was something strangely lonely about the way he sat there in the fading light. Aloan hesitated. The smart thing would have been to continue walking. The village was still half a mile away. She didn't know who he was. Travelers rarely passed through this part of the territory during winter. Yet something in his expression stopped her. Not fear, not anger, just weariness. The kind that settled deep into a person's bones. Slowly she approached. "Are you all right?" she asked. The stranger looked at her for a long second before answering. His voice was calm, but rough with fatigue. "I've had better days." She offered a small smile. "Do you need help finding shelter?" A faint breath of amusement touched his features before disappearing. "Shelter can wait." His gaze drifted toward the paper-wrapped loaf in her hand. Embarrassment flickered across his face. "Do you happen to have anything to eat?" The question hung in the frozen air between them. Aloan felt her stomach tighten again. Suddenly the loaf seemed heavier than before. It was all she had. Her dinner. Tomorrow's breakfast. Maybe even lunch if she stretched it carefully. The wind stirred through the cedar branches overhead. The stranger waited without speaking, as if he expected nothing. Aloan looked down at the loaf, then back at the man beneath the tree. And in that quiet moment, she realized she had a choice to make. Aloan stood motionless as the wind whispered through the cedar branches. The loaf rested in her hands, still warm beneath the paper wrapping. She could almost taste it already. The stranger did not speak again. He simply sat there, his silver-gray eyes calm and patient, as though he had already accepted whatever answer she might give. That somehow made the choice harder. If he had begged, she might have walked away. If he had demanded, she certainly would have. But there was no pressure in his gaze. Only quiet exhaustion. Aloan slowly lowered herself onto a nearby stone covered with snow and brushed the white powder aside. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had spent years learning how to live with less. Less food, less comfort, less attention, less kindness. Yet every sacrifice felt heavy when it arrived. She stared at the loaf for several seconds before releasing a soft breath. Then she held it out toward him. "Here." The stranger blinked. "All of it." Aloan forced a smile. "I do not exactly have anything else." For the first time, genuine surprise crossed his face. He looked from the bread to her and back again. "You should keep half." She shook her head. "You asked if I had something to eat." "I do." His eyes narrowed slightly as though he were trying to understand her. "And what will you eat?" The question landed harder than she expected. Aloan looked away toward the darkening forest. I will figure that out tomorrow. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the stranger carefully accepted the loaf. His hands were large, rough from labor, yet surprisingly steady despite his obvious fatigue. He unwrapped the paper and broke off a piece. The simple scent of fresh bread filled the cold air. Aloan immediately regretted her decision. Her stomach growled loudly enough that she almost laughed. The stranger heard it too. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. You are regretting this already. A little, she admitted. To her surprise, he laughed quietly. The sound was warm and unexpectedly pleasant. He broke the bread in half and held a piece toward her. Then share it with me. Aloan hesitated. I thought you were starving. I am. Then you need it more. And yet I am offering. His eyes held her steadily. After a long pause, she accepted the piece. The bread was smaller than what she had given him, but somehow it felt like more. They ate in silence while snow drifted lazily through the air around them. The forest seemed strangely peaceful, almost protected. When they finished, the stranger leaned back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes briefly. Color had already begun returning to his face. Thank you, he said quietly. Aloan shrugged. It was only bread. No. His gaze lifted to hers once more. It was not. Something in his voice made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She looked away first. You should head into the village. There is an inn near the square. And where are you going? Home. Alone. She smiled faintly. I usually am. For some reason, that answer seemed to bother him. A shadow crossed his features before disappearing. He studied her as though committing every detail to memory. Finally, he stood. He was taller than she had realized. Even tired and travel-worn, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed impossible to ignore. You helped a stranger tonight, he said. Most people would not have. Aloan adjusted her coat against the cold. Maybe most people are smarter than I am. Again, that small smile appeared. Perhaps. He glanced toward the valley where distant village lights flickered in the darkness. Then he looked back at her one last time. What is your name? Aloan Hartwell. He repeated it softly as though testing the sound. Aloan. The way he said it sent a strange warmth through her chest. And yours? She asked. For the briefest moment, something unreadable flashed in his eyes. Ronan, he replied. Then he inclined his head politely. Good night, Aloan Hartwell. She watched him disappear into the falling snow until the darkness swallowed him completely. Only after he was gone did she begin the walk home. Yet with every step, she found herself thinking about the stranger beneath the cedar tree and the peculiar look in his eyes when he had spoken her name. The cabin felt colder than usual that night. Aloan pushed open the wooden door and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the familiar scent of pine logs and old books. Usually the little house brought her comfort. Tonight it felt strangely empty. She hung her coat beside the door and stood quietly for a moment, listening to the wind brush against the walls. Then reality settled in. There was no dinner waiting for her. No loaf of bread resting on the table. No simple meal to end the day. Only a kettle, a few dried herbs, and the fading warmth of the dying stove. Aloan laughed softly at herself. Well, that was not very practical. Her voice sounded small in the silence. She knelt beside the stove and fed another piece of firewood into the flames. Orange light flickered across the room, painting soft shadows over the furniture she had repaired herself years ago. The kettle soon began to hum. She prepared a cup of herbal tea and carried it to the small window overlooking the snowy forest. Outside, moonlight covered everything in silver. Somewhere beyond those trees, the stranger named Ronan was continuing his journey. The thought surprised her. She should have forgotten him already. People passed through Black Hollow all the time. Travelers came and went. Yet she could still hear his voice. She could still remember the unusual intensity in his eyes whenever he looked at her. Aloan wrapped both hands around the warm cup. You are imagining things, she whispered. Even so, she found herself smiling. The tea eased some of the hunger, but not all of it. As the hours passed, sleep refused to come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the question he had asked. What will you eat? Such a simple question. Yet nobody had asked her something so personal in a very long time. Most people spoke to her only when they needed a service. Ronan had looked at her as if the answer genuinely mattered. Near midnight, she finally drifted asleep beside the stove. When morning arrived, Pale sunlight filtered through the frosted window. Eloan woke slowly and immediately felt the familiar ache of an empty stomach. She stretched, wrapped herself in a thick sweater, and stepped outside to begin another ordinary day. Snow sparkled across the valley. Smoke rose from distant chimneys in the village below. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. Or so she thought. By mid-morning, she arrived at the village square carrying a basket of sewing supplies. The square buzzed with conversation. Merchants opened stalls. Children chased one another through the snow. Farmers discussed weather forecasts near the well. But something felt different. People seemed unusually excited. Clusters of villagers stood whispering together. Eloan noticed several heads turning toward the main road leading into the territory. "What happened?" she asked an elderly baker arranging fresh rolls on a display table. The woman barely looked up. "You have not heard?" Eloan shook her head. "Heard what?" The baker lowered her voice dramatically. "Royal Scouts were spotted near the northern ridge before dawn." Eloan blinked. "Royal Scouts? From the capital?" The woman nodded eagerly. "They say important visitors may be traveling through Black Hollow." Excited murmurs swept through the square. Eloan tried not to laugh. The royal capital was hundreds of miles away. Powerful people did not visit forgotten territories like theirs. She thanked the baker and continued toward the tailor shop where she worked part-time. Yet as she crossed the square, a strange feeling settled into her chest. She could not explain it. The sensation was neither fear nor excitement. It was anticipation, as though something invisible had begun moving beneath the surface of her ordinary life. And somewhere deep inside, she found herself wondering if the mysterious traveler she had met beneath the cedar tree had truly been as ordinary as he seemed. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, but the strange feeling inside Eloan refused to disappear. She spent hours mending winter coats in the tailor shop, carefully guiding thread through worn fabric while conversations drifted around her. Every customer seemed to be talking about the same thing. Royal Scouts, riders on the northern roads, unusual movement near the border territories. By sunset, the rumors had grown larger than the mountains themselves. Some claimed a noble family was passing through. Others insisted a royal inspection was coming. A few whispered that someone from the capital had vanished and was being searched for. Eloan tried to ignore it. Rumors were the village's favorite pastime during winter. Yet every time she reached for a spool of thread, her thoughts drifted back to the traveler beneath the cedar tree. Ronan. Even his name lingered strangely in her mind. As darkness settled over Black Hollow, she closed the tailor shop and began the walk home. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, covering the road in fresh white powder. Lanterns glowed warmly in cottage windows. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, safe. Halfway home, she noticed hoofprints along the roadside. Not one horse. Many. Large horses. Well-shod and disciplined. The tracks were fresh. She slowed and studied them. Travelers occasionally crossed through the territory, but groups this size were uncommon. The hoofprints continued northward toward the forest. Eloan frowned. A cold breeze brushed her cheek. Suddenly, she remembered the confidence in Ronan's posture despite his worn clothing. The calm authority in his voice. The way he seemed completely unafraid of traveling alone through unfamiliar territory. Her stomach tightened. "No," she muttered to herself. "That is ridiculous." Yet the thought remained. By the time she reached her cabin, twilight had deepened into night. She lit the stove and prepared another cup of herbal tea. The house felt quieter than usual. She sat beside the window again, watching snow collect along the fence outside. Eventually her gaze drifted upward toward the moon hanging above the trees. "Who are you really?" she whispered. The question vanished into the silence. Sleep came easier that night, but dreams followed. She dreamed of standing beneath the cedar tree again. Snow fell softly around her. Ronan stood a few feet away, his face hidden in shadow. She could not see him clearly, yet she somehow knew he was smiling. Then the dream shifted. Bright banners appeared overhead. Hundreds of lanterns glowed against a dark sky. Voices echoed through a massive hall she had never seen before. And somewhere beyond the crowd, silver-gray eyes found hers. Eloan woke before dawn, her heart racing. Pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered glass. She sat upright and laughed softly at herself. It had only been a dream. Still, the feeling lingered. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold. Smoke curled from distant chimneys. For a few peaceful moments, everything seemed normal. Then a horn sounded across the valley. Alolan froze. A second horn followed. Then a third. Deep, powerful, formal. The kind used for official arrivals. Doors opened throughout the village. People stepped onto porches and into streets. Voices rose in confusion. Alolan followed the growing crowd toward the main road. Her pulse quickened with every step. When she reached the edge of the square, she saw villagers gathering along both sides of the street. Even the pack elders had appeared. Something important was happening. Very important. Then she heard it. The distant rhythm of approaching horses. Not a few riders. Dozens. The sound echoed through the valley like rolling thunder. Banners appeared first, dark against the morning sky. Then came armored riders mounted on powerful black horses. The crowd gasped. Every banner carried the same silver crest. The royal crest of Blackthorn. Alolan felt her breath catch. The capital had not sent scouts. The capital had come itself. The entire village seemed to stop breathing. Alolan stood among the crowd as the royal procession advanced down the snow-covered road. Sunlight reflected from polished armor. Dark banners rippled in the cold morning wind. The crest of Blackthorn appeared again and again, stitched in silver thread across cloaks, flags, and saddle blankets. Children stared in wonder. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Even the pack elders straightened their backs and adjusted their formal coats. Nobody wanted to appear unprepared before representatives of the crown. The riders moved with remarkable discipline, their horses stepping in perfect formation. At their center traveled an enormous black carriage trimmed with silver accents. It looked less like transportation and more like a moving piece of history. Alolan felt increasingly out of place, standing among the crowd in her simple wool coat. She considered slipping away before anyone noticed her. Then the procession slowed. A murmur spread through the villagers. The lead riders exchanged signals. Horses stopped. The carriage came to a halt directly in the center of the square. Silence followed. Complete silence. Alolan could hear only the wind and the distant creak of leather reins. Then the carriage door opened. Every person in the square leaned forward. Pack leader Cedric Holloway hurried down the steps of the meeting hall, nearly slipping on the snow in his rush to greet the visitors. His face wore an expression Alolan had never seen before. Nervousness. Genuine nervousness. "Welcome to Black Hollow," Cedric called. "We are honored by your presence." No answer came immediately. Instead, several royal guards stepped aside. A tall man emerged from the carriage. Gasps swept through the crowd. Alolan felt her heartbeat stumble. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Dark hair, broad shoulders, calm silver-gray eyes. Ronan. Her mind refused to accept what she was seeing. It could not be him. The traveler beneath the cedar tree had worn a weathered coat and carried no sign of status. Yet the man stepping from the carriage wore an elegant black coat embroidered with silver trim. He carried himself with effortless authority. The air itself seemed to shift around him. Villagers immediately lowered their gazes. Some bowed their heads. Others simply stared in disbelief. Alolan could not move. She could not even blink. Ronan surveyed the square slowly. For a brief moment his gaze passed over the crowd. Then it found her. The recognition was immediate. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. The same look he had given her beneath the cedar tree. Warm, steady, familiar. Alolan's breath caught. Around her, villagers continued whispering. "That is him. The Alpha King. King Ronan Blackthorn. He came here himself." The words echoed through her thoughts. Alpha King. The title struck harder than any winter wind. Suddenly, every strange detail made sense. The confidence. The composure. The riders she had unknowingly noticed on the road. The silver crest. The questions he had asked. Her stomach twisted. She remembered offering him her only loaf of bread. She remembered sitting beside him in the snow. She remembered speaking to him as though he were an ordinary traveler. Heat rushed to her face. Across the square, Cedric continued speaking nervously, but Alolan barely heard a word. The king never took his eyes off her for long. Finally, one of the royal advisors stepped forward and presented a formal scroll. The crowd expected an announcement concerning taxes, borders, or politics. Instead, the advisor spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. His Majesty has come to Black Hollow seeking one specific resident. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alolan's pulse quickened. The advisor unrolled the scroll. Aloan Hartwell. The entire square turned toward her at once. For a moment, Aloan wondered if she had heard incorrectly. Surely there was another Aloan Hartwell somewhere in the territory. Surely the royal advisor could not possibly mean her. Yet every face in the square had turned in her direction. Dozens of eyes fixed upon her at once. The murmurs grew louder. Confusion, curiosity, disbelief. Aloan felt rooted to the ground. Aloan Hartwell, the advisor repeated. Her name echoed across the silent square. Slowly, almost mechanically, she raised her hand. I am Aloan Hartwell. A ripple spread through the crowd. The advisor nodded respectfully. Respectfully. That alone shocked her. Nobody of royal rank had ever spoken to her with respect before. Then something even stranger happened. King Ronan stepped forward himself. The movement was simple, yet it instantly commanded the attention of every person present. He crossed the snowy square without hesitation. Villagers instinctively moved aside, creating a path between them. Aloan's pulse pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She watched him approach, each step bringing reality closer. Yesterday, he had been sitting beneath a cedar tree with snow on his shoulders. Today, he looked every inch a king. The contrast left her breathless. When he finally stopped before her, the square fell completely silent. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Ronan smiled. It was the same quiet smile she remembered from the forest. Good morning, Aloan Hartwell. The familiar warmth in his voice somehow made everything more overwhelming. Your Majesty, she managed. The title felt awkward on her tongue. Ronan's eyes brightened slightly. Yesterday, I was simply Ronan. Several villagers exchanged startled looks. Aloan felt heat rise into her cheeks. I did not know. I know. His expression softened further. That is exactly why I came. The crowd seemed unable to decide whether to stare at him or at her. Pack leader Cedric looked particularly bewildered. He stepped forward cautiously. Your Majesty, forgive my question, but how does a resident of Black Hollow know the Alpha King? Ronan glanced toward him. Because she treated me as a person rather than a title. The answer created another wave of whispers. Aloan wished the snow would open beneath her feet and swallow her whole. She had never enjoyed attention. Now the entire village was watching her conversation with the most powerful man in the kingdom. Ronan turned back to her. Did you sleep well? She blinked. Of all the questions he could have asked, that was not the one she expected. I suppose so. Good. His gaze lingered on her face. I was hoping you would not regret sharing your meal. The memory returned instantly. The loaf of bread. The cold evening. The cedar tree. Several nearby villagers gasped softly. They had heard every word. Aloan suddenly understood what was happening. Ronan was not hiding the truth. He wanted everyone to know. You really were hungry, she said quietly. A hint of amusement touched his features. Very. And you really traveled alone? For part of the journey. His smile widened. My advisors were not pleased when they discovered it. A few members of the royal entourage looked away with expressions that confirmed exactly that. For the first time since the procession arrived, Aloan nearly laughed. The tension eased slightly. Then Ronan reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I came here to thank you properly, he said. But there is something else I would like to ask. The square grew silent once more. Aloan stared at him as winter sunlight glimmered across the snow around them. Whatever happened next, she knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be ordinary again. Aloan stood silently as the Alpha King looked at her across the snowy square. The excitement surrounding them seemed distant now, drowned beneath the weight of everything that had happened since sunrise. Less than a day earlier, Ronan had been a stranger sitting beneath a cedar tree. Now he stood before her as the ruler of an entire kingdom. Yet somehow the most surprising part was not his title. It was the fact that he still looked at her exactly the same way. Ronan glanced at the folded document in his hand before returning his attention to her. Yesterday, he said softly, I mentioned that I had something else I wanted to ask. A flicker of recognition crossed Aloan's face. She had almost forgotten. So much had happened since then. Yes, she replied quietly. You did. The square grew silent once more. Villagers leaned forward. Even the royal advisors seemed interested in what would come next. Ronan's expression became thoughtful. I wanted to ask what taught you to do it. Aloan blinked. Do what? Give away your last meal. The question surprised her. She had expected something far more complicated. Around them, the crowd listened carefully. Eloan lowered her gaze for a moment. I do not know, she admitted. It just felt like the right thing to do. Ronan studied her face as though the answer itself mattered. Then a faint smile appeared. Exactly. Before she could ask what he meant, he reached inside his coat and withdrew a small silver medallion hanging from a leather cord. The polished surface caught the winter sunlight, sending flashes of silver across the snow. Several members of the royal escort immediately straightened. Whatever the object was, it clearly carried significance. Do you know what this is? Ronan asked. Eloan shook her head. No, Your Majesty. His smile widened slightly. Yesterday, I was simply Ronan. Warm laughter rippled through the crowd. Then his expression grew serious again. This medallion is carried only during what the crown calls a character journey. Curious murmurs spread among the villagers. Ronan slowly turned the medallion in his hand. Every ruler eventually faces the same problem. People stop showing them the truth. The crowd fell quiet. When merchants know you are a king, they speak differently. When strangers know you are a king, they behave differently. When people see power, they often stop revealing who they really are. His silver-gray eyes swept across the square. Titles reveal loyalty. They do not always reveal character. Silence settled over the village. Ronan continued. That is why, every few years, a ruler travels without ceremony, without banners, and without visible authority. Understanding dawned across Eloan's face. The cold road, the worn coat, the lonely cedar tree. None of it had been accidental. You were learning about your kingdom, she said softly. Ronan nodded. And about the people inside it. He paused. Most people taught me exactly what I expected. Something in his voice hinted at disappointment. Then his gaze settled on her. You did not. Eloan felt her pulse quicken. Around them, nobody moved. Throughout my journey, many people became generous after they recognized signs of wealth, Ronan said. Others became generous after learning my identity. A faint smile touched his face. Some became generous very quickly. A few royal advisors exchanged amused looks. Then the smile faded. But only a handful of people helped before they knew who stood before them. Eloan stared at him. A handful. Very few. His voice softened. And among them, you gave more than anyone else. She immediately shook her head. It was only bread. No. His answer came without hesitation. It was your dinner. The square fell silent. Snow drifted gently between them. You were hungry, Ronan continued. Yet you still chose kindness over comfort. Eloan looked away. I would have managed. Exactly. His words carried unexpected emotion. You sacrificed something that mattered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ronan revealed the truth that would change the entire tone of the morning. When I returned to my escort last night, I told them about you. Eloan blinked. Me? Yes. A genuine smile appeared. Because after weeks of traveling across the kingdom, I had finally met someone who expected absolutely nothing in return. The words echoed through the square. Ronan stepped forward slightly. Most rulers spend their lives searching for people they can trust. His gaze never left hers. Yesterday, beneath a cedar tree, I found one. A stunned silence followed. Even the royal advisors appeared impressed by the statement. Then Ronan slowly turned toward the gathered villagers. And if someone this trustworthy could remain unnoticed for years, he said quietly, what else have we all failed to see? The question settled across the square like falling snow, and for the first time, every eye turned toward Eloan with a new understanding. For several long seconds, nobody answered Ronan's question. The winter wind drifted through the square, stirring cloaks and banners alike, yet the silence remained unbroken. And if someone this trustworthy could remain unnoticed for years, what else have we all failed to see? The words seemed to linger over Black Hollow like falling snow. Eloan stood motionless beside the Alpha King, her heart beating faster than before. Around her, villagers shifted uneasily. Some looked down. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one appeared eager to speak first. Ronan did not press them. He simply waited. The patience in his expression somehow made the silence feel even heavier. Finally, an elderly merchant cleared his throat. Your Majesty, he said quietly. I think we stopped noticing because she never asked to be noticed. Several heads turned toward him. The old man looked toward Eloan. She was always helping someone. Always fixing something. always making life easier for everyone else. He paused. After a while, we started treating that as normal. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Ronan nodded slowly. That happens more often than people realize. The merchant lowered his gaze. And perhaps we forgot that ordinary kindness is not actually ordinary. The square fell silent again. Then a woman near the bakery stepped forward. 3 winters ago, my husband became ill during a blizzard. Her voice trembled slightly. Most people could not leave their homes because of the snow. She smiled faintly at Aloan. But she walked nearly a mile through waist-deep drifts to bring us food. Another villager nodded. She repaired my son's coat after he tore it climbing the mill fence. A blacksmith spoke next. She refused payment when my family could not afford it. Then another voice joined. And another. And another. One by one, stories emerged from every corner of the square. Small stories. Quiet stories. The kind that rarely appeared important in the moment. Yet together they painted a picture far larger than any single act. Aloan listened in stunned silence. Some of the memories had nearly vanished from her own mind. To her, they had simply been moments when someone needed help. Nothing more. Yet hearing them repeated aloud revealed something she had never truly understood. Her kindness had become woven into the lives of the people around her. Ronan watched the scene unfold with thoughtful eyes. Finally, he turned towards Cedric Holloway. The village leader immediately straightened. Pack leader, Ronan said. Cedric bowed his head respectfully. Your Majesty, tell me something. Ronan's voice remained calm. If I had never come here today, would this conversation have happened? The question struck the square with surprising force. Cedric opened his mouth, then stopped. For a moment he seemed unable to answer. Eventually he released a slow breath. No. The honesty in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. Ronan nodded once. I do not believe that makes Black Hollow cruel. The tension eased slightly, but I do believe it reveals something important. He looked across the gathered villagers. People often wait for greatness to arrive wearing a crown. His gaze shifted toward Aloan. Meanwhile, real character may be standing beside them every day. The words settled deeply into the crowd. Several villagers wiped away tears. Others nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in what he said. Cedric stepped forward until he stood directly before Aloan. The village leader, who had barely spoken more than a handful of words to her over the years, now lowered his head respectfully. Aloan Hartwell, he said. She looked up, startled. Yes. His voice carried across the square. Black Hollow should have thanked you a long time ago. Silence followed. Then the baker nodded. The blacksmith nodded. Families throughout the crowd nodded. One after another, the people of Black Hollow openly acknowledged what they had overlooked for years. Aloan felt emotion tighten her throat. She had never wanted recognition. Yet somehow receiving it felt like a wound she had forgotten she carried finally beginning to heal. Ronan glanced toward her and smiled. Do you see now? He asked softly. She blinked back tears. See what? His silver-gray eyes softened. Trust is easy to miss when it arrives quietly. He paused. But that does not make it any less valuable. For the first time in years, Aloan truly believed him. And standing in the center of the snowy square, surrounded by people who finally saw her clearly, she realized that kindness had never made her invisible. It had been revealing her character all along. For several moments, nobody moved. The square stood wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt different from silence. It was the stillness that followed understanding. Snow drifted gently through the winter air while the people of Black Hollow remained gathered around Aloan, no longer seeing her as the overlooked Omega who lived near the forest boundary. They saw her as she truly was. A woman whose character had quietly touched countless lives without asking for recognition. Aloan felt overwhelmed by the realization. For years she had believed she occupied only a small corner of the world. Yet standing there among her neighbors, she suddenly understood that her choices had mattered far more than she had ever imagined. Ronan seemed to sense her thoughts. He stepped beside her and glanced across the snowy square. A faint smile touched his face. This has been quite a morning. Soft laughter spread through the crowd. The tension that had filled the village since the royal procession arrived finally began to ease. Then one of the royal advisors approached carrying an elegant wooden case. The polished wood was dark and beautifully carved, marked with the silver crest of blackthorn. Curious whispers immediately followed. Ronan accepted the case and opened it carefully. Inside rested a detailed parchment map of the kingdom. Rivers, forests, mountain ranges, villages, and cities stretched across the page in remarkable detail. Aloan's eyes widened. She had never seen the entire kingdom displayed before her. Ronan pointed toward a small location in the northern territories. Black Hollow. Then his finger moved toward the center of the map. And this is Blackthorn City, the capital. The distance between them seemed enormous. Aloan stared at the route connecting the two places. Roads she had never traveled. Places she had never seen. Possibilities she had never considered. I have never been farther than the neighboring territories, she admitted. Ronan nodded. Most people have not. Then his expression softened. That does not mean their story ends there. The words settled gently into her heart. Around them, villagers listened closely. Everyone sensed that another important moment was approaching. Ronan closed the case and turned toward her fully. Aloan Hartwell. The crowd immediately grew quiet. On behalf of the Crown of Blackthorn, I would like to invite you to visit the royal capital as an honored guest. A collective gasp spread through the square. Aloan stared at him. She had expected gratitude. She had expected thanks. She had never imagined this. Why me? She asked softly. Ronan looked genuinely surprised by the question. For a moment he said nothing. Then a thoughtful smile appeared. Do you remember what I asked you beneath the cedar tree? Aloan blinked. Of all the things she expected him to say, that was not one of them. Slowly she nodded. You asked what I would eat the next day. And what did you say? A faint smile touched her lips. I said I would figure it out tomorrow. Warm amusement appeared in his eyes. Exactly. He paused, allowing the memory to settle between them. A person willing to go hungry so a stranger can eat deserves to see more of the world. The square fell silent. Even the winter wind seemed to pause. Emotion tightened Aloan's throat. She remembered that moment perfectly now. The cold, the hunger, the choice she had made without expecting anything in return. Ronan continued, his voice calm but sincere. The kingdom has many ambitious people. It has many talented people. What it will always need are people of character. His silver-gray eyes met hers. And character should never remain hidden. Slowly Aloan looked around the square. The baker smiled warmly. The blacksmith nodded proudly. Families she had quietly helped over the years watched her with genuine happiness. For the first time in a very long while, she felt completely seen. Not because of a king, not because of a title, because the truth had finally been acknowledged. She looked back at Ronan and smiled. Then I would be honored to accept. Applause erupted throughout the square. Cheers followed. Even members of the royal escort smiled openly. Ronan's expression brightened. Good. He handed her the wooden case containing the map. Keep this. Aloan carefully accepted it. The map felt heavier than parchment should. Not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. A larger world. A wider future. New chapters waiting to be written. Then Ronan extended his hand. Not as a king issuing a command. As a friend offering a path forward. After only a brief hesitation, Aloan placed her hand in his. Together, they began walking toward the waiting royal carriage. Behind her stood the village that had finally learned her worth. Ahead lay roads she had never imagined traveling. As they reached the carriage, Aloan glanced back one final time at Black Hollow. The snowy rooftops. The winding roads. The cedar-covered hills beyond the valley. Everything looked the same. Yet somehow everything had changed. Ronan followed her gaze. Are you nervous? He asked. She laughed softly. A little. Good. She looked at him in surprise. A faint smile touched his face. That usually means an adventure is about to begin. For the first time all morning, Aloan laughed freely. The sound seemed to brighten the winter air around them. Then she stepped into the carriage beside the Alpha King. As the royal procession finally began moving toward the distant capital, neither of them noticed the elderly royal advisor watching from horseback nearby. A knowing expression crossed his face before he looked toward the road ahead. Somewhere far away in Blackthorn City, news of Aloan Hartwell had already begun spreading through the capital. And though she could not possibly know it yet, the simple act of sharing a loaf of bread beneath a cedar tree had become the first chapter of a story that was only beginning.